Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Think and Speak English. I'm Julia, and it is so good to have you here with us again.
And I'm Adam. This is episode 7, and I have to say this is one of those topics that I personally find really interesting because it touches something very human.
It really does. Today we're talking about giving and receiving feedback gracefully in English. How to tell someone that something could be better, and how to hear that about your own work or your own ideas without it feeling like an attack.
And if you were with us in episode 6, you'll remember we talked about polite disagreement, how to say I see things differently without creating conflict. Today's topic is closely related, but it has its own specific challenges.
Because feedback is a little different from disagreement. When you disagree, you're usually talking about an opinion, something neither of you owns personally. But when you give feedback, you're often talking about someone's work, something they've created, something they care about.
And that makes it more personal, more vulnerable, and that changes everything about how the conversation needs to be handled.
Exactly. So today we're going to explore this from both sides, how to give feedback in a way that's honest but kind, and how to receive feedback in a way that's open and graceful, even when it's hard to hear.
And we're going to do this the way we always do, through conversation, through examples, through role plays, so it feels real, so it feels like something you can actually use.
Let's just start naturally. Adam, have you ever given someone feedback and it went badly?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. More than once, honestly. I remember one time, years ago, a friend asked me to read something they had written, a short story, and they asked, "What do you think?"
Oh, the classic question.
Right? And I was young, and I didn't really think about how to say it. I just said, I think the beginning is a bit slow, and the ending doesn't really land. And I meant it helpfully. I genuinely wanted to help.
But how did they take it?
Not well. They got very quiet. And then they said, "Oh, okay." And that was the end of the conversation. And for a while, things were a little awkward between us.
And you hadn't said anything cruel. You hadn't been mean. You were just direct.
Right? But I'd forgotten to acknowledge what was good first. I'd forgotten that they'd just handed me something they cared about, and I jumped straight to the problems.
And that's such a common mistake, especially for people who are used to being analytical or efficient. You think, they asked for my opinion, so I'll give them my opinion. But the emotional side of the exchange got skipped.
Completely. And I learned from that, the hard way.
I think most people learn the hard way with feedback, actually, because we're not usually taught how to do it. It's just assumed you'll figure it out.
Which is a shame, because it's such an important skill in workplaces, in creative collaborations, in friendships, in families. Feedback is everywhere, and most people are not very good at it.
So let's start with the giving side. What makes feedback land well? What's the difference between feedback that helps someone grow and feedback that just makes them feel bad?
I think the first thing, and we already touched on this, is starting with what's good. Not in a fake way, not just saying it's great before listing all the problems, but genuinely looking for what's working and naming it specifically.
Specifically is such an important word there, because it's great doesn't actually help anyone. It doesn't tell them what to keep doing. But the opening sentence really grabbed my attention, or I thought the way you structured the argument was really clear. That gives the person something concrete.
And it also shows them that you read it, or listened carefully, or paid real attention, which matters. Because if someone feels like you didn't really engage with what they did, your feedback loses credibility.
Right? You have to earn the right to critique, in a sense. And you do that by showing genuine engagement first?
Okay, so let's talk about what to do once you've acknowledged the positives. How do you introduce the parts that could be improved?
So in English, there are some really useful phrases that soften the transition. One of my favorites is, one thing I'd love to see more of is, because it frames the critique as something you want, not as something that's missing or wrong.
Oh, that's clever. Instead of the middle section is too vague, you'd say, I'd love to see more specific detail in the middle section.
Exactly. Same information, very different feeling. Because one version sounds like a problem, the other sounds like an opportunity.
Another phrase I use a lot is, I wonder if, as in, I wonder if this paragraph might have more impact if it came earlier in the piece. It's tentative, it's just a thought, and it invites the person to consider it rather than defend themselves.
That I wonder if structure is so useful because it positions you not as someone who knows better, but as someone who's curious, who's thinking alongside the person, not judging from above.
And there's also, have you thought about, or what do you think would happen if those are really collaborative ways to introduce a concern?
Because instead of telling someone what to do, you're asking them to think it through themselves. And often when people arrive at a conclusion themselves, they own it much more fully than if someone else told them.
That's such a smart point. The best feedback sometimes isn't feedback at all. It's a question that leads the person to their own insight.
Okay, let's do a role play. Let's say I've just finished writing a report for work, and I've asked you to read it and give me your thoughts.
Sure, okay. So, Julia, I read through your report, and first of all, I think the research is really thorough. The way you've used the data to support your main argument is genuinely impressive. That section in the middle where you break down the statistics, I found that really clear and well organized.
Oh, thank you. That section took me a while to get right.
It shows. Now, there is one area where I think the report could be even stronger, the conclusion. At the moment, it feels a little brief to me. I wonder if you might expand on the recommendations a bit, because the analysis is so detailed, and then the conclusion wraps up quite quickly. I found myself wanting a little more guidance on what to actually do with the findings.
Yeah, I think you might be right. I actually rushed the conclusion a bit because I was running out of time.
That makes sense. And honestly, the good news is the hard work is done. The analysis is all there. It's just about giving the recommendations the same level of care. Do you think you'd have time to expand that section before you submit?
Yeah, I think I can do that. Thanks, that's really helpful.
Okay, so let's just look at that exchange. A few things were happening there. First, I started with something specific and genuine, not just good job. I named what was working and why.
And then when you introduced the critique, you framed it as something that would make the report stronger, not as a failure, could be even stronger. Not there's a problem.
And I used I wonder if rather than you should. And then I explained why I felt that way, what it felt like as a reader. Because feedback that includes your experience as the receiver of the work is usually more persuasive than feedback that just states a judgment.
And at the end, you offered encouragement. The hard work is done. You helped me see that addressing the concern wasn't starting over. It was just a small step.
Which is true a lot of the time. When feedback feels overwhelming, it's often because the person imagines they have to redo everything. But often the feedback is really about one specific thing, and naming that clearly actually reduces the sense of overwhelm.
Let's talk now about the receiving side, because I think for a lot of people, receiving feedback is actually harder than giving it.
I think that's probably true because when you give feedback, you're in control, but when you receive it, you're the one being evaluated. And that activates something quite deep in most people.
A kind of threat response, like your brain reads the criticism as danger and wants to either defend or shut down.
Right? And neither of those responses is very useful. Defending means you stop listening. Shutting down means you lose the benefit of what someone is trying to tell you.
So what's the alternative? What does graceful feedback receiving actually look like?
I think the first thing is just creating a moment of pause before you respond. Because your first instinct when you hear something critical is almost never your best instinct.
Right? Your first instinct might be to say, well, actually, the reason I did it that way was, which is immediately defensive, or just to go very quiet and withdrawn.
But if you can pause, even just for a second, and let the information land, you give yourself a chance to hear it more clearly.
And then the next step is to respond with curiosity rather than defense, which can be as simple as saying, can you tell me more about that? Or could you give me an example?
Because those questions do two things. They buy you a little time, and they also show the other person that you're genuinely engaging with what they said, rather than just waiting for them to finish.
And in English, there are some really natural phrases for this. That's really helpful to hear. I hadn't thought about it from that angle. Can you say a bit more about what you mean?
And importantly, even if your initial reaction is disagreement, you don't have to voice that disagreement immediately. It's okay to say, thank you, I'll think about that, and then go away and actually think about it before you decide how to respond.
Which takes a certain kind of emotional maturity to not need to resolve it in the moment.
Let's do a role play from the receiving side. I've given Julia some feedback on a presentation she did.
Okay, go ahead.
So I really enjoyed your presentation overall. The content was really strong, but I did feel like at some points you spoke a little quickly and I found it hard to keep up with the information.
Oh, Yeah. Okay. Can I ask, was that throughout or more in certain parts?
More towards the middle, I think. When you were going through the data, it felt like a lot of information came quite fast.
Right? I think I was a bit nervous at that point, actually. I'd put a lot into that section and I wanted to get through it.
That makes sense. It's a common thing when you're nervous. But I think if you slowed down in those moments, the audience would actually absorb the data much better.
That's really useful to know. I'll keep that in mind for next time. Thank you for telling me.
And did you notice what Julia did there? She didn't immediately say, "Oh, I don't think I was speaking that quickly." She asked a clarifying question first. Was that throughout or in certain parts?
Because that question let me get more specific information, which made the feedback more useful. And it also gave me a moment to process before I responded.
And then you offered a bit of context. I think I was nervous, which is not defensive, it's just honest. It helps the other person understand your experience. And then you moved straight to what you'd do differently.
Right? I'll keep that in mind for next time. Which signals that the feedback landed, that you took it in, that it wasn't just falling on deaf ears.
And then ending with "thank you for telling me" is such a gracious thing to do. Because giving honest feedback takes a little courage, and acknowledging that courage encourages the person to be honest with you again in the future.
That's a really good point. If you react to feedback badly, people stop giving it to you, and then you lose something really valuable.
Whereas if you're known as someone who receives feedback well, people will be more honest with you, and that is an enormous advantage, professionally and personally.
Let's talk about a more difficult scenario. What if the feedback you receive feels unfair, or unkind, or just wrong?
Because that happens too. Not all feedback is good feedback. Sometimes someone says something that's just not accurate, or it's delivered in a way that feels harsh.
And in that situation, you still want to stay calm. You still want to respond from a place of curiosity rather than pure defense, but you also have every right to push back.
Right. Receiving feedback gracefully doesn't mean accepting everything without question. It means engaging with it seriously before you decide whether to take it on board.
So if someone says something that feels off, a useful approach is to ask for more specifics. Could you give me an example of what you mean? Because sometimes when you push for an example, the person realizes their feedback was too vague or wasn't quite accurate.
And if after hearing more you still feel the feedback is unfair, you can calmly say something like, "I hear what you're saying, and I've thought about it, but my experience of the situation was a bit different. Can I share my perspective?"
Which is very much in the spirit of what we talked about in episode 6. Disagreeing politely, because disagreeing with feedback is still a form of disagreement, and all the same principles apply.
Keep it calm. Acknowledge what you've heard, and then offer your own view without attacking the other person.
And sometimes feedback that feels wrong in the moment turns out to have something in it when you sit with it for a while, which is why that pause before responding is so valuable.
I've had that experience quite a few times, where my first reaction to feedback was, "That's just not right." And then I went away and thought about it and realized, actually, there was something there. They might have expressed it badly, but the underlying concern was real.
So staying open, even when your instinct is to close down, is really the key thing. Not because you have to agree, but because you want to give the feedback a fair hearing.
Let's talk about feedback in professional settings specifically, because there's a particular vocabulary and set of conventions around professional feedback in English that's worth understanding.
Yes, in most professional environments and English-speaking cultures, there's an expectation of what people sometimes call constructive feedback, which means feedback that is aimed at improvement, not just evaluation.
Right. It's not, "This is bad." It's, "Here is what could make this better." The orientation is forward-looking. It's about growth.
And one of the most widely known frameworks in professional settings is what some people call the sandwich method. You start with something positive, put the critique in the middle, and end with something encouraging.
Now, I'll say this. Not everyone loves the sandwich method. Some people think it's a little formulaic, and experienced professionals can sometimes see through it.
That's fair. If someone always uses exactly the same structure, it can start to feel a bit mechanical, a bit inauthentic.
But the underlying principle, the idea that you should support someone, not just criticize them, that's sound. The problem is only when it's done in a really rigid, obvious way.
So the more natural version is just to genuinely look for what's working, name it warmly, address the concern thoughtfully, and then close the conversation in a way that leaves the person feeling motivated rather than deflated.
Which requires you to be genuinely invested in the other person's success. And when that's real, people feel it. They don't feel like they're being managed. They feel like they're being helped.
Let's do a workplace role play. I'm a manager, and Adam is a team member. I've just reviewed his first project proposal.
Okay, ready.
Adam, thanks for sending over the proposal. I've had a chance to read through it. There's a lot of good thinking here. I can see you've put real effort into the research. And the problem statement in the introduction is very well framed. It really sets up the context clearly.
Thank you. I was quite pleased with that section.
It shows. Now, one area I think we need to develop further is the budget section. At the moment, it's a bit thin, the figures are there, but there isn't much explanation of the assumptions behind them. If we were to present this to senior leadership, they'd likely have a lot of questions about how we arrived at those numbers.
Right. I wasn't entirely sure how much detail was expected at this stage. I can definitely go back and add more justification to those figures.
That would be great. And I'd also suggest maybe adding a brief risk assessment at the end, nothing too long, just a paragraph or two acknowledging potential challenges and how we'd address them. It makes the whole proposal feel more complete.
Okay, That's a good point. How soon do you need it?
If you can get me a revised version by end of Thursday, that gives us time to review before the Friday meeting.
Thursday works. I'll get on that today.
Perfect. This is shaping up really well, Adam. I think with those additions, it'll be a strong proposal.
Thank you. I appreciate the feedback.
Okay, so in that exchange, a few things worth noticing. The manager was specific with the praise. The problem statement is very well framed. Not just good work, specific.
Then the critique came with context. Not just the budget section is thin, but if we were to present this to senior leadership, they'd have questions. So the reason for the concern was explained, which makes it easier to understand and accept.
And as the person receiving the feedback, I asked a clarifying question. I wasn't sure how much detail was expected, which is honest and non-defensive. It gives the manager information too. It shows it wasn't laziness. It was uncertainty about expectations.
And the conversation ended warmly. This is shaping up really well, which leaves the person feeling good about the work even while heading off to address some problems with it.
That's the goal. The person should leave the feedback conversation feeling motivated, not crushed, not defensive, but clear about what to do next and confident they can do it.
Because that's what feedback is for. It's not for making the feedback giver feel smart or important. It's for helping the other person improve.
And when you keep that purpose in mind, it guides all your choices. Every word you choose should be in service of that purpose.
Let's talk about something that comes up a lot for language learners specifically. What if you're in a situation where you need to give feedback and you're not confident in your English? What if you're worried that the words will come out wrong?
That's such a real concern. Because even native speakers sometimes struggle to find the right words for feedback. In a second language, it's even harder.
So I think the most important thing is to prioritize warmth over precision. If you're not sure of the exact phrase, but your tone is kind and your intention is clear, most people will receive it well.
Right. A slightly imperfect sentence delivered warmly is much better than a technically perfect sentence delivered coldly.
And you can also use hedging language to protect yourself if you're uncertain. Phrases like, I might be wrong, or this is just my impression, so feel free to push back. Those give you a safety net.
And they're also just very natural things to say. Even native speakers use them, so they don't sound like someone struggling for language. They sound thoughtful.
And if you make a mistake, if something comes out more bluntly than you intended, you can always recover. Sorry, I think that came out a bit harsher than I meant. What I was trying to say was, and then try again.
The repair is important because people can tell when you're genuinely trying to communicate with care, and they appreciate the effort to get it right.
Let's talk about one more specific situation, receiving feedback on your English itself. Because for learners, this is its own particular challenge. Being told your language needs work can feel quite personal.
Yes, because language is so tied to identity, especially if you're proud of how hard you've worked to learn English. Hearing that something was unclear or incorrect can sting.
But feedback on language is so valuable. If someone takes the time to tell you that a sentence was confusing or that a phrase you used doesn't quite mean what you thought it meant, that's genuinely helpful, even if it doesn't feel that way in the moment.
So if someone corrects your English, instead of feeling embarrassed, you can try to reframe it in your mind. They're not telling you you're bad at English. They're helping you get better.
And you can respond gracefully with something like, "Oh, thank you for pointing that out. How would you say it?" Which shows you're interested in learning, not just in saving face.
And that's actually a very admired quality in English-speaking cultures. The willingness to ask for correction, to be curious about your own language, it shows confidence. not weakness.
Because only someone who is secure in themselves can say, I got that wrong. Can you help me understand? That takes real self-assurance.
Let's also briefly talk about written feedback, because a lot of feedback in professional settings happens in writing, in emails, in comments on documents, in performance reviews.
And written feedback has its own particular challenges because you don't have tone of voice, you don't have facial expression. The words are just sitting there on the screen.
Which means things can feel harsher than they were intended. Something that would sound gentle in person can read as quite blunt in an email.
So when you're writing feedback, you have to be even more deliberate about your language. You have to put the softening in explicitly, because the voice can't do it for you.
So phrases like, I hope this is helpful at the start, or let me know if you'd like to discuss any of this at the end. They add warmth to what might otherwise feel like a cold list of comments.
And using I language in written feedback is just as important as in spoken. I found this section a little hard to follow rather than this section is unclear, because one is your experience and one is a judgment.
And checking your written feedback before you send it is always worth doing. Just read it once and ask yourself, if I received this, how would I feel? That one question can catch a lot of potential problems.
That's a simple but really powerful habit. Read it as the receiver, not the giver.
Okay, let's do one final role play before we start to bring things home. This time, I want to do something where the feedback is a bit harder to hear, where there's a real concern being raised, and we'll see how both sides handle it.
Let's do it. Okay, so I'll be giving the feedback. Julia has just delivered a presentation to a client, and I was in the room. This is a review conversation afterward.
Okay.
So, Julia, thanks for taking some time to debrief. How do you think it went?
Honestly, I thought it went pretty well. The client seemed engaged, and we got through everything on the agenda.
Right. I agree that the content was solid, and the client was definitely paying attention. I do want to share one observation, though, and I hope it's useful. There were a couple of moments where the client asked questions, and I felt like the response was quite brief, almost a bit deflecting. And I noticed that they asked the same question twice, so I think they might not have felt fully answered the first time.
Oh. Actually, I remember that moment. I wasn't entirely sure how to answer, and I didn't want to say something wrong, so I kind of sidestepped it.
I understand that instinct completely. But I think from the client's perspective, even a more honest answer like, that's a really good question, and I want to make sure I give you the right information. Can I come back to you on that? Would have landed better than a brief response that didn't quite answer them.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I panicked a little and tried to move on, and that probably wasn't the best call.
It happens to everyone, and for what it's worth, the rest of the presentation was genuinely strong. This is just one thing to think about for next time.
No, I'm glad you told me. That's the kind of thing that's hard to see in the moment. Can we maybe talk through how you'd handle a question like that? Just so I have something to fall back on?
Absolutely. Let's do that.
So notice how that conversation moved. The feedback was real. It was pointing to something that genuinely didn't go well, but it was framed with care. I hope it's useful. I understand that instinct. It happens to everyone.
And as the person receiving it, instead of defending the choice too hard, you acknowledged the reality of the situation. I think I panicked a little. That honesty takes courage, and it actually makes the conversation go better.
Because when you admit something openly, the other person doesn't need to push harder. The conversation can move forward rather than getting stuck on whether there was a problem.
And then you turn the feedback into a learning moment by asking, can we talk through how you'd handle it? Which is such a great move. It closes the loop. You've received the feedback and now you're already acting on it.
That's the ideal response to feedback. Really, not just thank you and then nothing changes, but Thank you, and now let's figure out what to do about it.
It turns feedback from a moment of evaluation into a moment of growth.
Which is what feedback is really for.
Let's start to bring things gently toward the end of today's episode, because we've covered a lot of ground, and I want to make sure we leave you with something that feels settled, something you can hold on to.
Yes. So if there's one thing we want you to remember about giving feedback in English, it's this. Be specific about the good, be gentle about the concern, and keep your purpose clear. You are there to help, not to judge.
And if there's one thing to remember about receiving feedback, it's this. Pause before you respond, let the information in before you react, and try to stay curious rather than defensive.
And both of these things, giving and receiving, get better with practice, with time, with each conversation you have.
For B2 learners specifically, we want to say you are at a stage now where these nuanced conversations are within reach. You have the vocabulary, you have the grammar. What you're building now is the emotional intelligence and the cultural awareness to use what you have in the most effective way.
And that is a really exciting place to be because the language skills can only take you so far. What makes communication truly powerful is the human element, the care, the attention, the genuine desire to connect.
And you wouldn't be here, listening to this, thinking about how to communicate better, if you didn't already have that desire, so you're already most of the way there.
Don't be too hard on yourself when feedback conversations are imperfect. When you say something that lands wrong, or when you hear something and your defenses go up before you can stop them, that's just being human.
The goal is not perfection. The goal is awareness. Each time you notice what happened and think about what you might do differently, you've already grown.
And there's something really beautiful about the whole idea of feedback. When you think about it, it says, I see you, I think you're capable of more, and I care enough to tell you.
That's the gift inside every piece of honest, kindly delivered feedback, even when it stings a little.
So let's learn to give that gift well and to receive it gracefully when it comes to us.
All right, everyone, that is episode 7, Giving and Receiving Feedback Gracefully in English. We hope today felt rich and useful and most of all real.
In episode 8, we'll be exploring how to handle awkward silences and keep conversations going in English. Because sometimes the hardest moment in a conversation is when the words just stop. And knowing what to do in that moment is a real skill.
We can't wait to dig into that one with you. Until then, keep thinking, keep speaking, and keep growing, because that's exactly what you're doing.
This is Think and Speak English. We'll see you in episode 8. Take care of yourselves, everyone.
Goodbye. See you next time.
Bye.